Ready to dive into some seriously fascinating stories. We're talking about the 84 mahasiddhas, these legendary figures who achieved enlightenment.
But not always in ways you might expect.
Right, that's what makes them so interesting. So today's source is this PDF titled Life Story of 84 mahasiddha.pdf. It's packed with all these wild details about their lives.
Yeah, it really highlights how they sort of broke the mold when it comes to what we usually think of as a spiritual path.
Okay, so for those just tuning in, can we break down who these mahasiddhas actually were?
Absolutely. The term mahasiddha basically refers to someone who's achieved a high level of spiritual realization, kind of like a saint or a sage.
Okay, so far so good. But what makes them different from, say, a monk meditating in a monastery?
Well, the mahasiddhas didn't exactly fit the traditional image of a spiritual seeker.
Yeah, the PDF mentions blacksmiths, cobblers, even kings.
Exactly. They came from all walks of life, which totally challenges the idea that you need to renounce the world to achieve enlightenment.
So for those listening who might be feeling a little stuck in their own lives, the mahasiddhas seem to be saying, hey, enlightenment isn't about escaping your circumstances.
It's about finding a new perspective within them.
I like that. So it's not about where you are, but how you see things.
Exactly. And that brings us to their practices, which honestly can seem a bit out there at first glance.
Yeah, the PDF talks about visualizations, working with energy, things that might seem kind of strange outside the context of, what was it called?
Tantra.
Right, Tantra. Can you give us a quick breakdown of what that is and how these practices fit into that whole framework?
Sure. Tantra is a spiritual tradition that views the universe as this web of interconnected energies. And these energies exist within us too.
Yeah, I'm following so far.
So the mahasiddhas believed that you could harness and transform these energies for spiritual growth. Those visualizations you mentioned weren't just daydreams.
So they were using these techniques to basically reshape their internal energy.
Exactly. It's like an internal alchemy for personal transformation.
Pretty radical.
Right.
Totally. Kind of makes me wonder, could their methods offer us some insights into dealing with, all the mental overload we face today?
That's a really interesting connection. While our source doesn't explicitly say that, it's a thought-provoking question for sure.
Okay, so we've got these unconventional figures using some pretty unusual techniques, but the PDF is also full of these wild stories about them facing all sorts of challenges.
And overcoming them in pretty mind-blowing ways.
I'm ready for a good story. What do you got?
Well, there's this one classic tale where a mahasiddha is challenged to prove they've achieved enlightenment by making their staff fly.
Ooh, sounds like a test.
It is, but instead of conjuring up some magical spectacle, the mahasiddha just calmly replies, "My staff only flies when I need to cross a river."
Wow, what a response. So they weren't interested in showing off?
Not at all. Their focus was on practicality and using their abilities for what truly mattered.
Which I guess makes you wonder about the nature of proof in these kinds of situations.
Right. It's not always about what you can see, but about a deeper understanding of reality.
Oh, that reminds me of another story from the PDF. A king asks a mahasiddha for a donation.
And instead of offering riches, the mahasiddha suggests the king donate the weight of his own body in food to the poor.
Whoa! That's a serious power move.
Right. It flips the script on what we think of as generosity.
It's like they're challenging us to redefine our values and find the deeper meaning behind our actions.
Precisely. It's not about the outward form, but the inner intention.
Man, these stories really make you think. But honestly, what strikes you as the most lasting legacy of these mahasiddhas? What can we, in the 21st century, actually learn from their lives and teachings?
I think their biggest takeaway is that there isn't one right way to live a spiritual life. They were all about breaking free from limitations and embracing individual expression.
So instead of trying to fit into some predefined box, they're suggesting we look for the cracks, the places where we can break through.
Exactly. And remember, these were people who experimented, adapted, and found their own unique expressions of enlightenment. That blacksmith we mentioned earlier, he's a perfect example of that.
It's a powerful reminder that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to spiritual growth. We all have our own unique paths to walk.
And our own inner mountains to climb.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, a little laughter can help us along the way.
That's something that really stands out about them. Their sense of humor. It's almost like they were laughing their way to enlightenment.
Now that you mention it, I'm remembering that story about the mahasiddha who was confronted by this super serious scholar questioning their practices.
Oh yeah, that one's a classic. The scholar was practically bursting with indignation, accusing the mahasiddha of straying from the true path.
So how did the mahasiddha respond to that?
Well, instead of getting defensive, they simply said, my path may seem unconventional, but it leads to the same destination as yours. It's like climbing a mountain. There are many trails, but the peak is the same.
Huh? I can just picture the scholar's face. It really shows how the mahasiddhas weren't afraid to challenge rigid dogma.
And find humor in the face of criticism.
Do you think that humor was a deliberate tool for them, or just a natural expression of their state of being?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it points to a key insight. They encourage us to be discerning, to question everything, and to find our own truth.
So instead of clinging to one rigid interpretation, they're saying, be open to multiple perspectives.
Exactly. Remember, they weren't a homogenous group following a single set of rules.
Right. They were individuals who experimented, adapted, and found their own unique expressions of enlightenment.
Just like that blacksmith.
It's a powerful reminder that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to spiritual growth.
We all have our own unique paths to walk.
Our own inner mountains to climb. And maybe a little laughter can help us along the way.
Exactly. And the mahasiddhas, through their stories and teachings, can be our guides and inspirations on that journey.
Okay, I have to admit, you've got me hooked. I need to know more about these mahasiddhas and their incredible feats.
Oh, there's so much more to uncover. We've only just scratched the surface.
Well, let's keep digging.
Sounds good to me. You know, as we're talking about all this, it makes me think about how the mahasiddhas probably attracted their fair share of critics, too.
Oh, yeah. I bet not everyone was thrilled about their unconventional ways.
Especially given how they challenged the status quo.
Yeah, the PDF actually mentions a story where a group of these really respected scholars confronts a mahasiddha.
Questioning their methods and accusing them of basically straying from the accepted path to enlightenment.
Ooh, that must have been intense. How did the mahasiddha handle that kind of criticism?
Well, instead of getting all defensive or arguing back, you know what they did?
What?
They just smiled and said something like, you've spent years studying scriptures and debating all these fine points, which is great, but I've learned through direct experience, through actually diving deep into my own being.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. They're basically highlighting the difference between book knowledge and lived experience.
Exactly. And it's such a relevant message for us today, too. We're bombarded with information all the time, but it's easy to get lost in all the intellectual stuff.
Yeah, you can read about swimming all you want,
Yeah.
but you won't really know until you jump in the water.
Right. The mahasiddhas remind us that real understanding comes from direct experience, from actually feeling and embodying the truth in our own lives.
So it's about getting out of our heads and into our hearts.
I like that. It's about trusting our intuition and inner knowing just as much as we trust external sources.
Makes sense. And that brings us to another key aspect of their teachings, this emphasis on personal exploration.
Yes. They really understood that there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to spiritual growth.
So they encourage people to find their own unique paths.
Absolutely. And you see this reflected in the sheer diversity of their practices. The PDF mentions visualizations, breathwork, mantras, working with nature. It's like they were saying, here's a whole toolbox full of possibilities. Try them out and see what works for you.
It's like a spiritual buffet. But how did they know which techniques were effective? Were they just experimenting randomly?
Well, the PDF doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of how they chose their practices, but it does suggest they had a really deep understanding of subtle energies.
Both within the human body and in the universe at large.
Right. The system is often called Tantra, and it views the human body as like a microcosm of the cosmos.
So they were working with a pretty sophisticated system. This wasn't just random trial and error.
Not at all. They believed the human body contained all these energies and possibilities of the universe itself.
So by working with their inner energies, they were tapping into the fabric of reality.
Exactly. That's where practices like visualization come in. They weren't just creating pretty pictures in their minds. They were techniques for actually directing energy.
Wow, so they were using visualization to transform their consciousness and even influence the world around them.
That's the ideal. And, you know, that brings us to another fascinating aspect of their teachings, the idea that limitations are often self-imposed.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about external obstacles, but the barriers we create within ourselves.
Yes. They believed that our beliefs, fears, and patterns of thinking can really hold us back.
So we create our own limitations.
In a way, yes. And the mahasiddhas offered a powerful antidote to that, a radical embrace of freedom.
Freedom. Now that's a word I like to hear. What did they mean by that exactly?
Well, for them, freedom wasn't just about doing whatever you wanted. It was about liberating yourself from those limiting beliefs, from societal conditioning, from the illusion of a separate self.
So it's about recognizing our interconnectedness
Yeah.
and stepping into a more expansive way of being.
You got it. And this freedom wasn't just some abstract concept. They actually lived it. Challenging social norms, embracing unconventional practices, expressing their unique individuality.
That's so inspiring. It's like they're saying, don't let anyone tell you who you are or what you're capable of. Trust yourself and break free from the mold.
I love that. And that message is so relevant for us today, too. We're constantly being told who to be, what to buy, how to live.
But the mahasiddhas remind us that our true nature is boundless, and we have the power to create our own reality.
It's a big responsibility, though, right? To actually take ownership of our lives and create the reality we want.
It can feel daunting, for sure.
Yeah,
But the mahasiddhas also face challenges and doubts just like we do.
exactly. And
Yeah.
they never gave up on their pursuit of freedom and enlightenment.
So it's okay to stumble, make mistakes, question everything. It's all part of the process.
Absolutely. The more we embrace the unknown, the more we step outside our comfort zones, the more we open ourselves up to possibilities.
I like that. That's a really beautiful thought. It makes me wonder about the specific ways they navigated challenges. Did they have any teachings or practices to help them overcome adversity?
Oh, definitely. And there's this one story from the PDF that really highlights their resilience and resourcefulness. It involves a mahasiddha traveling through this really dense forest, and they come across this raging river blocking their path.
Oh no, was there a bridge?
Nope, no bridge in sight, and the river was supposed to be super dangerous, full of treacherous currents and scary creatures.
Yikes. So what did they do?
You'd think they'd freak out, right? Or start trying to build a raft or something. But this mahasiddha, they just sat down on the riverbank and closed their eyes.
Closed their eyes. What were they doing?
They went into a deep meditation, focusing on the element of water within their own body.
Wait, the element of water within their body. I don't think I follow.
Remember how we talked about the human body being a microcosm of the cosmos? They believed all the elements of nature exist within us too.
Oh, right. So they were meditating on the water element inside themselves to connect with the river outside.
Exactly. And as they went deeper into their meditation, something incredible happened. The PDF says the river miraculously parted, creating a dry path for them to walk across.
No way. Seriously. That's amazing. It's like they dissolved the obstacle by harmonizing their inner world with the outer world.
That's a great way to put it. It's a powerful example of how they saw reality as this fluid, interconnected thing.
Yeah.
And how they use their understanding of energy to actually influence their surroundings.
So it wasn't magic in the traditional sense. It was about aligning their consciousness with the forces of nature.
Right. And this story teaches us so much about the power of our own minds to overcome challenges that seem impossible.
It's like they're saying when you change your inner world, the outer world reflects that change.
Exactly. Sometimes the most effective way to overcome an obstacle isn't to fight it head on, but to shift our perspective, to find that harmony between our inner and outer realities.
Wow, this is all so fascinating. And I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to these mahasiddhas and their teachings.
Absolutely. And one of the most mind-blowing things is how they view the nature of reality itself. They challenge so many assumptions we take for granted.
I'm definitely curious to hear more about that. Tell me everything. What was their take on reality?
Well, for starters, they didn't see the world as this fixed and solid place. It was more like a constant dance of energy.
Okay, so everything is in motion and always changing.
Right. And we're not separate from this dance. We're participants in it, co-creating our reality through our thoughts, emotions, actions, even our beliefs.
So we're not just passively observing the world, we're actively shaping it.
Exactly. And here's where things get really wild. They believed our perception of reality isn't objective.
What do you mean?
It's filtered through our own conditioning, our experiences, our beliefs about ourselves and the world.
So it's not just about seeing things as they are, it's about seeing things as we are.
You got it. Which means we have the power to change our experience of reality by shifting our perception, by questioning our limiting beliefs, and by cultivating a more expansive and compassionate worldview.
That's powerful. So they're saying if we change our inner world, the outer world will change too.
Exactly. And this leads to another mind-bending idea, that limitations are often illusions.
Illusions? How so?
They saw the boundaries we perceive those lines between ourselves and others, between the material and the spiritual, as mental constructs, not fundamental truths.
So they were challenging that dualistic way of thinking that creates separation.
Yes. They offered a vision of reality where everything is interconnected, where the divine is present in everything, and where those boundaries are ultimately permeable.
That's a beautiful and empowering way to see things. It suggests we can experience a much more expansive reality than we realize.
Absolutely. And the mahasiddhas offer us a guide for how to unlock that potential. They invite us to question our assumptions, to explore our own depths, and to embrace the transformative power of consciousness.
It sounds like a grand adventure, one that requires courage, curiosity, and a willingness to step outside our comfort zones.
Exactly. Like any great adventure, it's full of twists and turns, moments of joy and moments of challenge. But ultimately, it leads us to a deeper understanding of ourselves, the world, and that interconnectedness of everything.
You've definitely sparked my curiosity. I want to learn more about their practices, their perspectives, and how they applied these teachings in their lives.
Yeah.
What should we explore next?
Well, I think it would be fascinating to dive into some of their more unconventional teachings, the ones that really push the boundaries of what we consider normal spirituality.
Ooh, like what?
For example, the PDF mentions how they used humor song and even provocative behavior as tools for awakening.
Now that sounds really interesting. I can't wait to see where this deep dive takes us. All right, so we're picking up where we left off. These mahasiddhas, they were using humor, song, even kind of provocative behavior as tools for enlightenment.
It might seem strange, right? But these methods were all about shaking people out of their usual ways of thinking, kind of disrupting their reality a bit.
Okay, so it wasn't just about being shocking for the sake of it. There was a real method to the madness.
Exactly. And the source material gives this great example with a mahasiddha who was known for his, well, let's say eccentric behavior.
Okay, I'm picturing something pretty out there. What did he do?
This mahasiddha, he'd wander through the marketplace, dressed in rags, singing these nonsensical songs, dancing like nobody was watching.
I mean, that sounds more like a street performer than an enlightened master.
Right. But that was kind of the point. He wasn't trying to fit into any preconceived notions of what a spiritual person should be.
So he was intentionally challenging people's expectations.
Absolutely. And it worked. People would stop and stare, some would laugh, some would get angry, but everyone was forced to confront their own ideas about what it meant to be normal, to be spiritual.
It's like he was holding up this mirror to society, showing them the absurdity of their own rigid beliefs.
Exactly. And in doing so, he created these openings for people to wake up to their true nature, to see beyond the limitations of their own minds.
So sometimes the most effective teaching isn't about words or lectures, it's about embodying a different way of being.
Even if it seems unconventional, maybe even a little crazy.
Right. And that brings us to another interesting aspect of their teachings. Using humor as a tool for growth.
Humor. I like where this is going.
Yeah. But for the mahasiddhas, it wasn't just about telling jokes. It was about pointing to the absurdity of taking ourselves too seriously.
Right. That need to be right, to be important, to control everything.
Exactly. And there are all these stories in the PDF where they used humor to kind of deflate egos, challenge authority, and expose the flaws in rigid belief systems.
There's one story I really like. This mahasiddha gets confronted by a group of scholars about their practices.
I bet those scholars weren't too happy.
Nope. They were pretty upset, accusing this mahasiddha of disrespecting tradition. But instead of arguing, the mahasiddha just smiles and tells them a joke.
Seriously.
A joke.
Yep. And unfortunately, the PDF doesn't tell us the punchline, but it says the scholars were totally disarmed.
They were expecting a fight, and instead they got a laugh.
Exactly. It's a great example of how humor can be this powerful tool for dissolving tension, for breaking down barriers, for creating space for new possibilities.
It's like sometimes the best response to conflict isn't anger or defensiveness. It's that light touch that can completely change the energy. Well said. And that brings us to another element of their teachings that might surprise people. The use of song and music.
Song and music. I love that. It's not what you typically think of when you imagine spiritual practices.
Right. But many of the mahasiddhas were actually really skilled musicians. They incorporated singing, chanting, playing instruments into their practices.
It must have created a completely different atmosphere than silent meditation.
Absolutely. It was much more vibrant, more embodied. They understood that sound and vibration can really impact our consciousness.
So music was a way to connect with something deeper within themselves.
Exactly. And they experimented with all sorts of styles, devotional hymns, folk tunes. Some were even described as being really wild and raucous.
It sounds like they were tapping into the full range of human experience.
They saw music as a way to bypass that thinking mind, and tap into something more intuitive.
So it was about transcending the limitations of the rational mind and accessing deeper states of consciousness.
Exactly. And that idea, transcending limitations, that's really what their teachings are all about. They challenge us to question what we think is possible.
To break free from the stories we tell ourselves, to awaken to our full potential.
Precisely. And, their stories really highlight the diversity of paths to awakening. There's no one right way. It's about finding what works for you.
And maybe having a little fun along the way.
Absolutely. A little humor, a little music, a little willingness to embrace the unexpected. That's what the mahasiddhas were all about.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been truly mind-expanding. The mahasiddhas, they offer such a fresh perspective on spirituality and what it means to live an enlightened life.
I couldn't agree more. They remind us that the path to awakening is a personal journey, and it's often about embracing the unconventional, challenging the status quo.
And finding that joy and freedom right in the midst of life's complexities.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up this episode, I invite you to consider what really resonated with you today. What unconventional practice or perspective shift might unlock new understanding in your own life?
That's a great question for all of us to think about. And as always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary world of the 84 mahasiddhas.